After a week in paradise, I thought I was coming home to my sanctuary. I'd spent 7 days in Hawaii with my best friend Melissa, posting sunset photos and trying local food, completely disconnected from family drama. The moment I turned my key in the front door, something felt different. The house was too quiet, too organized, but nothing could have prepared me for what I found when I climbed those familiar stairs to my bedroom. I pushed open my door and froze. My bed was gone. My desk vanished. The posters I'd carefully arranged on my walls had been stripped away, leaving behind faded rectangles where they used to hang. Instead, there was a complete gaming setup. 3 monitors arranged in a perfect arc. LED lights casting rainbow colors across the walls. A professional microphone suspended from an adjustable arm, and a gaming chair that probably cost more than my entire semester's textbooks. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just redecorating. This was erasure. Every trace of Rebecca Martinez had been systematically removed from what had been my space for the past 4 years. The room looked like a tech store showroom, sterile and impersonal, designed for one purpose: content creation. "Kevin," I called out, my voice cracking slightly. My 16-year-old brother appeared in the doorway almost instantly, like he'd been waiting for this moment. His expression wasn't apologetic or surprised. It was defensive, with an undertone of smugness that made my stomach clench. "Oh hey, you're back," he said casually, leaning against the doorframe like this was perfectly normal. "How was Hawaii? What happened to my room?" The words came out sharper than I intended, but I was beyond caring about tone. Kevin shrugged, a gesture so dismissive it felt like a physical slap. "Mom and Dad said I could use it for streaming. My setup was too cramped in my old room." He gestured at the equipment like he was showing off a prize. "This is way better for content creation. Better lighting, more space for the camera angles." The casual way he said it, like my entire living space was just a business decision, sent a wave of something cold through my chest. "Where are my things?" "Storage," he said, already turning away. "Most of it's in the shed. Mom organized everything while you were gone. She said you'd understand." Understand. That word echoed in my head as I stood there, still holding my Hawaii souvenir bag, feeling like a stranger in my own home. 4 years of college, working part-time to help with family expenses, never asking for anything major, always being the responsible one. And this was my reward. My space had been given away like I was already gone. I found my parents in the living room, Dad watching TV while Mom scrolled through her phone. They looked up when I walked in, and I saw something in their expressions that chilled me. They weren't surprised to see me upset. They'd been expecting this conversation. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Dad muted the TV, but didn't turn to face me completely. "If this is about the room situation, Rebecca, we can discuss alternatives." "Alternatives?" The word felt foreign in my mouth. "That was my room. You gave away my room while I was gone for a week." Mom finally looked up from her phone, her expression a mixture of irritation and forced patience. "You're 19, Rebecca. Kevin needs space for his streaming career. This is an investment in his future." Career. As if 8 months of inconsistent uploads and 12 subscribers constituted a career. But I bit back that response, trying to approach this rationally. Where exactly am I supposed to sleep? Study? Keep my things? Dad's answer came without hesitation. delivered in the same tone he might use to discuss the weather. "We cleaned out the shed. It's got electricity, and we moved your desk out there. It'll be like having your own apartment." The shed. They wanted me to live in the shed like garden equipment that needed to be stored. I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw something that made my chest tight. They weren't joking. They weren't even slightly apologetic. This wasn't a temporary solution or a misunderstanding. This was their plan. "The shed," I repeated slowly. "You want me to live in the shed. It's a nice shed," Mom added quickly. "We put in a space heater, and there's a window for natural light." "Kevin really needs that room, honey. His setup requires specific acoustics and I don't matter," I finished for her. The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's jaw tightened, and I saw a flash of something in his eyes. Not guilt, but annoyance. Annoyance that I was making this difficult instead of just accepting their decision gracefully. "That's not fair, Rebecca," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction. "You know we love you. This is just about making practical decisions for the family." Practical decisions. Like I was a problem to be solved rather than their daughter. I stood there, looking at these people who had raised me, fed me, supposedly loved me, and realized something that felt like a physical wound. I had never been the priority. Even when I was the one getting good grades, working to help with expenses, never causing drama, I was still secondary to whatever Kevin needed. Dad leaned forward, and his next words came with the kind of finality that left no room for negotiation. "Rebecca, you can either accept the shed arrangement or you can find somewhere else to live. Kevin's future is too important to compromise because you can't be flexible." The ultimatum hung in the air between us like a challenge. My parents sat there, waiting for me to fold, to accept their decision and move my life to accommodate their golden child's dreaming dreams. They expected compliance because that's what I'd always given them. The good daughter who never made waves, who always understood when sacrifices needed to be made. But something had shifted in me during those 7 days in Hawaii. Maybe it was being away from the family dynamics, or maybe it was seeing how Melissa's family treated her with basic respect and consideration. Whatever it was, I felt something crystallize in my chest, a clarity I'd never experienced before. "Okay," I said quietly. Mom's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good, I knew you'd—" "I'll find somewhere else to live." The words surprised even me. I hadn't planned to say them, but once they were out, they felt absolutely right. Dad's expression shifted from confident to uncertain, and Mom's phone slipped slightly in her hands. "Rebecca, don't be dramatic," Dad said, but there was something new in his voice. "We're not kicking you out. We're offering you a perfectly good solution." "You're offering me a shed," I said. And for the first time in this conversation, I felt completely calm. After giving away my room to fund Kevin's hobby, that's not a solution. That's not even an option. I turned and walked upstairs, my heart pounding but my mind crystal clear. In Kevin's new streaming room, my former bedroom, I looked around one more time. This space held 4 years of memories, late-night study sessions, phone calls with friends, the quiet moments that make up a life. Now it was optimized for content creation, every personal element stripped away. My clothes were indeed in garbage bags in the shed, along with my books, desk, and the little things that had made that room mine. As I gathered what I could carry, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Relief that the pretense was finally over. relief that I no longer had to wonder where I stood in this family hierarchy. I packed methodically, taking only what I truly needed: my laptop, some clothes, important documents, and the money I'd been saving from my part-time job at the campus coffee shop. As I moved through the house, my parents watched me with expressions that shifted between annoyance and the first hints of concern. "Rebecca, think about this practically," Mom called from the kitchen as I loaded my car. "Where are you going to go? How are you going to afford rent?" The question hung in the air, and I realized they genuinely believed I couldn't survive without them. That despite working, despite good grades, despite being the responsible one, I was fundamentally dependent on their goodwill. The assumption was so condescending, it actually helped steel my resolve. "I'll figure it out," I said, closing my trunk. Dad appeared in the doorway, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been regret cross his face. But then Kevin walked up behind him, and Dad's expression hardened again. The message was clear. They had chosen their side. As I drove away, I didn't look back at the house. In my rearview mirror, I could see my parents standing in the driveway, probably expecting me to circle back within an hour, ready to accept the shed and apologize for being difficult. Instead, I drove straight to Melissa's apartment. The next 72 hours taught me more about survival than 19 years of comfortable family life ever could. Melissa's couch became my temporary base of operations, while I figured out my next move. Her parents, when they heard what had happened, were horrified in a way that validated every feeling I'd been questioning. "They did what?" Melissa's mom had said, her voice rising in genuine outrage. "Over a streaming room?" That reaction, the shock and indignation from people who barely knew my family, helped me understand that what had happened wasn't normal family conflict. It was something else entirely. Sitting in Melissa's living room with my laptop, I started making lists. Financial reality check. I had $847 in savings and a part-time job that paid $12 an hour. I was a sophomore with decent grades but no family financial support anymore. The math was intimidating but not impossible. I called the financial aid office first thing Monday morning. "I need to speak to someone about updating my dependency status," I told the counselor. The words felt foreign but necessary. "Has there been a change in your family situation?" she asked gently. "You could say that," I replied, staring at my notes. "My parents have made it clear that continued housing is conditional on accepting living arrangements I can't accept. I need to explore my options for financial independence." The conversation that followed was eye-opening. There were procedures for students in situations like mine, resources I hadn't known existed, and a support system designed for people who found themselves suddenly on their own. For the first time since leaving home, I felt like I had a path forward. By the end of my first week of independence, I had a plan. I'd increased my work schedule to 25 hours a week, applied for additional financial aid, and put my name on the waiting list for student housing. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was going to be mine. The hardest part wasn't the financial pressure or the uncertainty about housing. The hardest part was the silence from my family. 3 days after I left, my phone had buzzed with a text from Mom. "This is ridiculous. Come home and we'll work something out." But there was no follow-up, no call, no acknowledgement that maybe they had made a mistake. The silence told me everything I needed to know about how they viewed this situation. They expected me to break first, to come back grateful for whatever scraps of consideration they were willing to offer. Instead, I threw myself into building a life that didn't require their approval. My grades, free from the stress of family dynamics, actually improved. I started sleeping better on Melissa's couch than I had in months in my own bed. The coffee shop where I worked became not just a job, but a community of people who respected my work ethic and treated me like an adult. 2 weeks after leaving home, I was sitting in the student center between classes when my phone rang. Mom's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment, my heart rate spiked. I almost answered automatically, the way I always had, ready to absorb whatever crisis or demand was being presented. Instead, I let it go to voicemail. The message, when I listened to it an hour later, was exactly what I expected. A mixture of guilt, manipulation, and veiled threats. "Rebecca, this has gone on long enough. Your father is very disappointed in your behavior. Kevin is upset that you're making this about him when it's really about you being selfish. We raised you better than this. Call me back and we'll discuss you coming home." I saved the message, but I didn't call back. For the first time in my life, I was experiencing what it felt like to make decisions based on my own well-being, rather than my family's expectations. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. 3 weeks in, I found a studio apartment 20 minutes from campus. It was tiny, barely furnished, and cost more than half my monthly income, but it was mine. Signing that lease felt like signing a declaration of independence. I was no longer Rebecca Martinez, the accommodating daughter who absorbed family dysfunction to keep the peace. I was Rebecca Martinez, the person who chose her own living conditions and her own future. The apartment came with challenges I hadn't anticipated. Learning to budget for groceries, utilities, and textbooks required a level of financial planning I'd never needed before. But with each bill I paid myself, each decision I made independently, I felt something growing in me that I finally recognized as self-respect. My parents' contact attempts became sporadic and increasingly frustrated. A text here, a voicemail there, each one carrying the same underlying message. This rebellion needed to end, and I needed to come back and resume my role as the family member who sacrificed for everyone else's benefit. But I was discovering something they hadn't counted on. I was actually good at taking care of myself. My grades were the highest they'd ever been. My work performance earned me additional responsibilities and a small raise. I was making friends who knew me as an independent person rather than someone's accommodating daughter. By the end of my second month of independence, I realized that my parents had given me an unexpected gift by forcing me to choose between dignity and comfort. They had pushed me to discover capabilities I'd never needed to develop while living under their roof. I was stronger, more resourceful, and more confident than I'd ever been. The silence from home became less painful and more informative. It told me that my family's love had always been conditional on my compliance. When that compliance ended, so did their interest in maintaining a relationship with me. It was a harsh lesson, but it was also clarifying. I was learning to build a life based on mutual respect rather than unexamined obligation. It was harder than being the good daughter who never made waves, but it was also infinitely more honest. For the first time in my life, I was living as myself rather than as who my family needed me to be, and that I was beginning to understand. was worth everything I'd had to give up to achieve it. By month 8 of my independence, I had settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable for the first time since leaving home. My studio apartment had transformed from a bare necessity into something that actually felt like home. I'd found furniture at thrift stores, hung plants by the single window, and created a study space that was entirely my own. The coffee shop had promoted me to assistant manager, which came with better hours and enough of a raise to cover my rent without the constant anxiety of whether I'd make it through the month. But the real transformation was internal. The Rebecca who had left her parents' house in a rush of hurt and determination had evolved into someone I barely recognized in the best possible way. I was making decisions based on what I wanted and needed, not on what would keep peace in a dysfunctional family system. My grades had climbed to a 3.8 GPA. I'd made the dean's list for the first time, and I was actually enjoying my psychology courses instead of just grinding through them. The silence from my family had become so complete that when my cousin Sarah texted me out of nowhere, it felt like hearing from another lifetime. "Hey Rebecca, long time no talk. How's school going?" Sarah was my dad's sister's daughter, 3 years older than me, and someone I'd always liked but rarely talked to outside family gatherings. Her casual message felt loaded with subtext, and I found myself staring at it for several minutes before responding. "School's good, really good actually. How are you doing?" Her response came quickly. "That's awesome to hear. I was wondering, would you want to grab coffee sometime? I'm in town for work next week." Something about the timing felt deliberate, but I agreed to meet her anyway. Sarah had always been one of the more sensible members of our extended family, and I was curious about what had prompted her sudden interest in reconnecting. When we met at a cafe near campus, Sarah's demeanor confirmed my suspicions that this wasn't just a casual social call. She hugged me warmly, commented on how good I looked, and spent the first 10 minutes asking genuine questions about my classes and job. But I could see something else in her expression, a kind of careful concern that suggested she was building up to something. "So," she said finally, stirring her latte unnecessarily, "I have to ask, what's really going on with you and your parents? Because the family is getting some very different stories." I felt my stomach tighten. "What kind of stories?" Sarah looked uncomfortable. "Well, your parents are saying you just left over some minor disagreement about room arrangements. They're making it sound like you're being dramatic and stubborn, and that they're just waiting for you to come to your senses." The casual way she relayed their version of events made something cold settle in my chest. Of course, they weren't telling people that they'd given away my bedroom to fund Kevin's streaming hobby, and then offered me a shed as an alternative. Of course, they'd reframed the entire situation to make me look like an ungrateful daughter having a tantrum. "And what's the other story?" I asked. Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Well, Kevin posted something on social media a few months ago about his new streaming setup, and the room looked really familiar, like exactly like your old room. And then my mom mentioned that she hadn't seen you at any family events lately, which is weird because you never missed stuff like that." I found myself telling Sarah the whole story, the Hawaii trip, coming home to find my room converted, the ultimatum about the shed, the decision to leave. As I talked, I watched her expression shift from confusion to recognition to something that looked like anger. "They wanted you to live in the shed," she said when I finished. The actual storage shed. With a space heater, I added, and the absurdity of it made us both laugh, though not in a way that felt particularly funny. Sarah shook her head slowly. Rebecca, that's not normal family conflict. That's genuinely messed up. Having someone from my own family validate what I'd been feeling was both relieving and infuriating. It confirmed that my decision to leave hadn't been an overreaction, but it also meant that my parents had been deliberately misrepresenting the situation to make themselves look reasonable. How's Kevin doing? I asked, partly out of genuine curiosity, and partly because I wasn't sure I wanted to keep talking about my own situation. Sarah's expression shifted to something between sympathy and secondhand embarrassment. Not great, honestly. The streaming thing, it's not really working out. He's been at it for almost a year now, and I think he's made maybe $100 total. Your parents keep talking about it like it's this huge investment in his future, but from what I can see, he mostly just plays games and occasionally remembers to turn on the camera. The information hit me in a complex way. Part of me felt vindicated. My room had been sacrificed for something that wasn't even successful. But another part of me felt genuinely sorry for Kevin. He was 16 and had been encouraged to pursue something unrealistic instead of focusing on school or developing actual skills. And your parents? I asked. Sarah hesitated. They ask about you sometimes, not directly, but they'll make comments about hoping you come to your senses soon, or wondering if anyone has heard from you. But they also seem, I don't know, almost stubborn about it. Like they've convinced themselves that if they just wait long enough, you'll apologize and everything will go back to normal. The conversation with Sarah stayed with me for weeks. It was one thing to know intellectually that my parents were probably spinning the story to make themselves look better, but hearing it confirmed felt different. It also made me realize that they genuinely believed I would eventually break and come back, accepting whatever terms they offered. That realization was liberating in a way I hadn't expected. They were waiting for me to fail, to need them, to prove that I couldn't actually make it on my own. Instead, I was thriving in ways I'd never imagined possible. My life had structure, purpose, and most importantly, peace. I wasn't walking on eggshells or managing other people's emotions, or sacrificing my needs for someone else's wants. As winter turned to spring, my confidence grew alongside my independence. I'd made friends at work and school who knew nothing about my family drama and valued me for who I was rather than how well I managed family dysfunction. I was dating someone for the first time in my life without having to worry about how my family would receive him or what they might demand of my time and attention. The 1-year anniversary of leaving home approached like a milestone I hadn't quite expected to reach. A full year of financial independence, academic success, and personal growth. A full year of my family choosing to maintain their position rather than acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, they had handled things poorly. I was at work on the exact anniversary date when my phone started buzzing. The first call was from my mom, which I let go to voicemail out of habit, but then it rang again immediately, and again. By the time I finished my shift, I had 17 missed calls from my mother and 3 from my father. The voicemails, when I finally listened to them, told a story of escalating panic. The first few were typical. Mom's voice strained but controlled, asking me to call her back, saying there were family matters we needed to discuss. But by the 7th or 8th message, something had clearly changed. Her voice was shaky, sometimes tearful, occasionally angry. "Rebecca, I don't know what game you think you're playing, but this has gone too far. Your father is beside himself, Kevin is struggling, and I can't keep pretending this is normal. We need you to come home. We need to talk about this like adults." The final voicemail was the most revealing. "Please, Rebecca, I know you're angry, but we're family. Families work through problems together. Call me back, please." Something had shifted in their world, something significant enough to crack their certainty that they could simply wait me out. I felt a mixture of curiosity and wariness as I considered whether to respond. Part of me wanted to know what had happened, but a larger part of me recognized that whatever crisis had prompted this sudden urgency wasn't necessarily about wanting a genuine relationship with me. I decided to call Sarah instead. "Oh my God, Rebecca," she said as soon as she heard my voice. "I was wondering if you'd heard." "Heard what?" "About Kevin. He got academic probation at school, like serious probation. Apparently he's been skipping classes to focus on streaming, and his grades are terrible. Your parents just found out, and they're freaking out, because if he doesn't turn it around, he might not graduate on time." The pieces started falling into place. Kevin's streaming career, the thing my bedroom had been sacrificed for, wasn't just unsuccessful. It was actively interfering with his actual education. The investment my parents had made in his future was backfiring spectacularly. "There's more," Sarah continued. "My mom talked to your Aunt Linda, and apparently your parents are having some financial stress too. Something about your dad's job, and they've been putting money into Kevin's equipment and setup. And now with his school situation." I felt a complex mix of emotions as Sarah filled in the details. There was vindication, certainly. The decision to prioritize Kevin's hobby over basic family fairness was proving to be as short-sighted as I'd suspected. But there was also genuine concern, especially for Kevin, who was 16 and had been encouraged to make choices that were now damaging his actual future. "They've been asking family members if anyone has heard from you," Sarah said. "Not in a casual way, but like they're actually worried. Your mom asked my mom if she thought you were okay, if you were getting by financially." The question of whether I was getting by financially struck me as particularly telling. They'd been expecting me to fail, to come back out of necessity rather than desire. The fact that I was not just surviving, but actually thriving, seemed to be more unsettling to them than my absence itself. Over the next few days, the calls continued but became less frequent. I didn't respond to any of them, partly because I wasn't sure what I wanted to say, and partly because I suspected that responding would open a floodgate of manipulation and emotional pressure that I wasn't prepared to handle. Instead, I focused on my own life, which was approaching another major milestone. I'd been accepted into an accelerated program that would allow me to finish my bachelor's degree a semester early, and I'd been offered a position as a student supervisor at the coffee shop, which came with better pay and management experience. My therapist, who I'd started seeing a few months earlier, had helped me recognize patterns in my family relationships that I was determined not to repeat in my other relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me that as my family's situation seemed to be deteriorating, mine was improving in ways I couldn't have imagined a year earlier. I wasn't getting better to spite them. I was getting better because I was finally in an environment where I could focus on my own growth instead of managing everyone else's problems. But the calls kept coming, and eventually I realized I would need to make some kind of decision about whether to engage with whatever crisis had prompted this sudden urgency to reconnect. The decision came to me on a Thursday evening in late spring. I was studying for finals, feeling good about my upcoming exams and my plans for summer classes, when my phone rang again. This time it wasn't my parents, it was Kevin. I stared at his name on my screen for several seconds before answering. Rebecca? His voice sounded younger than I remembered, uncertain in a way that was completely different from the smugness I'd encountered that day I came home from Hawaii. Hi, Kevin. Can we talk? Like, actually talk? There was something in his tone that made me pause my studying. What's going on? Everything's messed up, he said, and I could hear what sounded like genuine distress in his voice. The streaming thing, it's not working. School is a disaster. Mom and Dad are fighting all the time, and they keep saying it's because you left and everything fell apart, but I know that's not true. The admission surprised me. I'd expected Kevin to be defensive, to blame me for disrupting the family by refusing to accept their decision. Instead, he sounded like he was questioning the entire narrative that had been constructed around my departure. Kevin, I said carefully, what exactly is going on at home? Dad might lose his job, something about budget cuts at his company, and they spent so much money on my setup, and I'm not making any money from it. I'm barely getting any viewers, and now I'm failing 2 classes, and they're talking about me having to repeat junior year if I don't turn things around. The picture he painted was one of a family system that had been more fragile than I'd realized, held together by assumptions and expectations that were now crumbling under the weight of reality. Mom keeps saying that if you came back, things would go back to normal, but I don't even know what normal is anymore. Kevin continued, and I keep thinking about that day you left and how I didn't even think about what it would be like for you to come home and find your room gone. I was just excited about having more space. His honesty was disarming. I'd spent a year being angry at Kevin for his role in what had happened, but listening to him now, I realized he'd been 16 and caught up in his parents' decision-making without fully understanding the implications. Kevin, I said, I need you to understand something. I didn't leave because of you, or even because of the room. I left because of how Mom and Dad handled the situation. The ultimatum, the expectation that I would just accept whatever they decided without any input or consideration for my needs. I know, he said quietly. I think I always knew that, but it was easier to pretend it was just about you being stubborn or dramatic. We talked for almost an hour, and by the end of the conversation, I had a much clearer picture of what had been happening in my absence. My parents had convinced themselves that my leaving was a temporary tantrum that would resolve itself once I realized I couldn't manage on my own. When I didn't come back, and when their other plans started falling apart, they'd begun to panic. The family system that had functioned through my willingness to absorb problems and smooth over conflicts was struggling without someone to play that role. Kevin, despite being the supposed beneficiary of the new arrangement, was drowning under pressure he wasn't equipped to handle. And my parents, faced with the reality that their decisions had consequences, were looking for someone to blame. Do you think? Kevin hesitated, Do you think you might ever come back? Like, if things were different? It was a question I'd been avoiding thinking about directly, but hearing it from Kevin forced me to confront it honestly. I don't know, I said. A lot would have to change, and not just practically, but in terms of how everyone understands what happened and what went wrong. What do you mean? Kevin, our parents convinced themselves that they made a reasonable decision, and I overreacted until they can acknowledge that maybe giving away someone's bedroom while they're on vacation and then offering them a shed as an alternative isn't actually reasonable. I don't see how we can have a real relationship. After we hung up, I sat with the conversation for a long time. Something had shifted, not just in Kevin's understanding of the situation, but in my own sense of what might be possible. For the first time since leaving home, I was hearing acknowledgement that maybe the problem wasn't just my unwillingness to be flexible, but acknowledgement from Kevin was different from acknowledgement from my parents. And even if they were ready to admit they'd handled things poorly, I wasn't sure I was ready to risk the stability and peace I'd built for myself on the possibility that they had genuinely changed. The next few weeks brought a new pattern of communication. Kevin would text occasionally, updating me on school or just checking in. My parents' calls became less frequent but more strategic, always timed for when they thought I might be feeling lonely or stressed, always carrying subtle messages about family obligations and the importance of forgiveness. But the most telling development was what I learned through Sarah and other family members about how my parents were talking about the situation. They'd begun acknowledging, at least to extended family, that maybe they'd mishandled some aspects of the room situation. It wasn't a full admission of wrongdoing, but it was the first crack in their absolute certainty that they'd been reasonable and I'd been dramatic. As my second year of independence began, I found myself in the unexpected position of having some leverage. My family needed something from me, whether it was my return, my forgiveness, or just my presence to restore some sense of normalcy to their lives. For the first time in our relationship, I was the one with the power to set terms and conditions. The question was what I wanted to do with that power, and whether the family I'd grown up in was capable of the kind of fundamental change that would make a relationship worth rebuilding. 3 months later, I would get my answer in the form of 60 missed calls and a text message that would force me to decide once and for all whether the people who had raised me were family worth fighting for, or simply people I happened to share DNA with, who had never learned to treat me with basic respect. The choice for the first time in my life would be entirely mine to make.